Yes, we are here, and now we're turning on the video.
Fantastic. Welcome everyone on behalf of the ADRA Foundation. I'll let Joachim initiate the meeting.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. So we are here now live on the air, and also here in Glasgow, Scotland, with our panel on strengthening global climate governance. My name is Joachim Onkelbaan, and I'm the representative for Sustainable and Just Economic Systems at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. But soon I will be changing jobs because I will be working at the World Economic Forum on trade and climate change. So this event today is hosted by the ADRA Foundation and also by the International Environment Forum at the Interfaith Scotland here in Glasgow. This event will run for about the next 2 hours. And then we will have a 15-minute break at 5 p.m. GMT. And after that, we will have the launch of the eco-pledges of the Scottish Baha'is for about 15 minutes. So on that note, let me ask, why do we talk about governance? And why do we talk about governance in the context of climate change? So to go back to the word of governance, where does it come from, right? Actually, it comes from a Greek word for steering a ship or navigating. And it was actually Plato who used the word of steering for the first time in the context of politics and in terms of steering a society. So governance is really about agency, it's about action. And I wrote a book a few years ago about governance for the Sustainable Development Goals, which also covered climate change. And there I talked about what actually governance covers. So governance covers mainly 3 things. It covers the policies, so regulations, laws, something like the Paris Climate Agreement, it's a policy. It covers politics, so the power dynamics around climate change, for example. And it also covers the polity, so the institutions, the United Nations, governments, judges who get more and more involved in climate governance. So governance covers a lot. And then my second question was, why do we need to talk about governance in the context of climate change? So in my book, I quote experts who say that the climate crisis is more like a crisis of governance than a crisis of the environment. Then if we get to one of my main operating principles in my work and my daily life, then I usually think about the oneness of humanity, the unity of humanity. And I try to uphold that principle every single day, even when it's not always easy to uphold these days. And I think unity of humanity also means, in a sense, that we are all together on the ship, on this planet, that we try to steer together. So we need to find ways to steer our common ship towards a safe harbor amidst the perfect storm, which is climate change. Then today with us, we have a very inspiring panel that will look at climate governance from different perspectives. And before I give the word to our distinguished panelists today, I suggest that we hold a moment of silence just to settle in, to settle down, to take a deep breath, and just to get into the energy for the meeting for a moment. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Maya, may I first give the word to you?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Joachim, for that excellent introduction to our time today together. So I'm going to start us off by just talking for a few minutes about the Climate Governance Commission that I've been helping to establish with the Swedish Global Challenges Foundation, and importantly, the interim report of the Climate Governance Commission, which I hope Ismail will share in the chat. It's freely available online. And the interim report's name is Governing Our Climate Future. We just released this in October. And all of our first panelists have contributed to this report, Arthur, Haldor, Augusto, and Joachim, on various really important and vital dimensions of this climate governance challenge. And I love this suggestion that the climate challenge is really essentially a challenge of governance. That's very much in line with our thinking. So firstly, just a few brief thoughts on where we are as an international community. How are we coping at the moment with this governance challenge under our current architecture and our approaches, the political approaches, the intentionality approaches, the ethical approaches. So according to recent UNFCCC updates on national climate action plans of the approximately almost 200 countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement released earlier this autumn, the national commitments received to date, if implemented, would result only in about a 9% emissions cut by the end of the decade versus the 45% emissions reduction that we need by 2030 to really try to stay on track to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So currently the world is on a warming path to a catastrophic 2.1 degrees Celsius warming. And scientists, of course, have warned us that global temperature increase above 1.5 degrees Celsius substantially increases the risk of disastrous and irreversible consequences caused by global warming. And indeed, of course, we've all seen, even now, with the increase to date, the cascading consequences that are already happening all around the globe. So in terms of our shared climate governance as a human community, the unity of all of us confronting this challenge as an international community, we need to think creatively and quickly. We need to reflect on the various options that might be available to us to, at a macro level, stabilize the global climate system, this planetary system, which is indeed interrelated to other ecological dimensions and planetary boundaries. So in our view, we really need to think about what are the options to support, to strengthen our global climate governance, to meet the moment and to really tackle this challenge. The UN Secretary General, for example, has urged all states in the world to declare a state of climate emergency. He said the recent IPCC report was a code red for humanity. But it seems still our policymakers, leaders, and indeed the general public still has not internalized really the extent and the urgency of the needed action and coordination and collaboration at the international level, which really must be unprecedented if we're going to meet this objective to keep within a safe, hopefully safe or safer global temperature rise bandwidth. So the Climate Governance Commission, we very much wanted to be positive, solution-oriented. And a starting point of the Commission is that we have already existing viable technological, economic, social solutions that exist that would keep us on track to limit global temperature rise. But these solutions need to be supported and implemented through effective policy, finance, and leadership, crucially this human dimension at all levels of governance, if we're going to rapidly implement these solutions on a global scale. So the Commission's interim report diagnoses three key interrelated global climate action gaps. What are we missing in our societies? So first, this climate solution action gap. There are with existing technology, there are solutions that we can implement, technological, economic, and social. These are mapped out, for example, by different initiatives. One that we have been partnering with is the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, which shows, according to various sectors, building, agriculture, et cetera, how we implement existing solutions technology to meet the Paris Agreement targets. But these solutions are not being applied and executed at the speed and scale required to match the gravity of the climate emergency. Secondly, there's a climate policy gap to ensure that solutions of various types are implemented. We need policies, adequate policies especially at the national level and various levels of national governance, so that the incentive structures are in place for individuals, businesses, and nations to conform with the Paris Agreement climate goals. So again, such policies exist and have been on the agenda for many years. For example, carbon pricing, putting a price on carbon, removal of fossil fuel subsidies. I'm sure Augusto will touch on some of those. But these policies, again, they are not being put into effect quickly, widely enough, and they're not being systemically scaled up at the global level to meet our action targets. And finally, the last gap that we have diagnosed is this climate governance gap, and really at the international global level, because states to date have been very hesitant to put in place stronger global governance mechanism across a whole range of areas, but definitely in environment and climate. So, and we'll focus on different dimensions of this in this panel. So we need purposeful, functional governance mechanisms to supplement and further the really tremendous achievement of the Paris Agreement of 2015. And the interim report, you can see the discussion of those first two action gaps of solutions, policies, but then part two of the report we present no less than 23 different proposals on global strengthening our shared collective global governance. And we do this from a perspective of sort of a bottom-up and near-term perspective. We're suggesting, for example, how do we establish some new platforms to de-risk global climate finance? There's a proposal for a global green hydrogen alliance. How can countries across the world collaborate to accelerate green hydrogen technology, which could be a game changer in the energy mix? We have a suggestion for a global climate policy clearinghouse. So states around the world, instead of reinventing the wheel every time they implement a climate action policy, can share experiences, learn from best practices, and really accelerate this diffusion of the implementation of climate policies. And there's a range of other really near-term mechanisms that we can take collaborating globally to strengthen our very near-term action, which we must do. We also in the report talk about longer-term global governance reform, which we'll likely need in order to really tackle these unprecedented planetary ecological challenges. Arthur and colleagues have written about a global environment agency, which has been on the agenda for quite some time. Augusto, Arthur, and I talk about potential reforms of the UN Charter, which again has not been reformed for 75 years. It's not fit for purpose to meet our contemporary existential challenges. We also talk about an international court for the environment, where barristers in the UK and elsewhere have been advocating for the past decade or so. So this is really a menu that we present in the report of global governance proposals. And we really hope that this will fuel further discussion, consideration among decision makers, stakeholders, also among the general public to really think about this global governance gap and what we can all bring to the national policymakers or cities or vital actors also to say, listen, we have to act and implement action at all levels, but we also need to think at this vital global level, and we have a whole range of options that are viable and on the table. So I'll stop there, Joachim, and look forward to discussion.
Thanks so much, Maya. So for our next panelist, we are switching to the virtual world, to Augusto. Augusto, can we find you in cyberspace?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Hello, Augusto. Hey, could you please first share with us your current affiliation? Thank you.
Hi, I am the chair of the Global Governance Forum. And what I like to do today, if I have your permission, is to go ahead and talk a little bit about financing mechanisms for climate change mitigation. Essentially, coming out of Paris in 2015, there was a consensus that over the next 15 years, by 2030, we needed to spend something like, between $75 and $90 trillion in various forms of improving our infrastructures, creating low carbon resilient infrastructures, investing in energy efficiency and renewable energy and so on. And the reason to do that was because we wanted to make it easier for all the countries in the world to adapt to climate change. And equally importantly, because we wanted to preserve the development gains that we had made over the last 25, 30 years. Let me illustrate what we mean by development gains. For instance, in the last 30 years, until 2019, we had made huge progress in reducing extreme poverty. In 2020, because of COVID, that progress has been reversed, and we have added 100 million people to the headcount of extreme poverty. So that is a setback. It is essentially something that we would wish to avoid if accelerating climate change was going to kick in a big way, and it was going to unravel a lot of the progress that we have made in recent decades in improving the standard of living of vast numbers of the human population. Now, although there was agreement that we needed to do this huge financing, there was also an understanding that this would be a tall order, essentially because countries are under pressure. The public finances are in a somewhat tenuous way. We're still living the after effects of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Just to give you an example, in 2020, because of COVID, public debt levels on average across the world have risen by 20 percentage points of GDP. There is no period in the last 100 years where we have seen that increase in public debt. In Paris, there was a commitment to make available to the developing countries something like $100 billion per year from the developed countries to assist in this transition, but that number has never been reached. And so in any case, it's highly inadequate against the challenges of raising $75 to $90 trillion over this 15-year period. So the paper which I have written as part of this Climate Governance Commission is essentially focused on, what are the instruments that we can think up, that will actually facilitate the raising of these resources. And the first one that I want to focus on, although I would mention 3 or 4, is basically carbon taxes. The IMF has stated that, I quote, of the various mitigation strategies to reduce CO2 emissions, carbon taxes are the most powerful and efficient. This is essentially what the IMF has done. I think this is a very useful study. They have said that if, for instance, we want to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees, which is already uncomfortably high, Maya has made, I think, a compelling case for 1.5 degrees, and that seems to be the consensus across the world. But let's say 2 degrees, then we need to increase carbon taxes with the current average, which is about $2 to $3 per ton of carbon dioxide, to something like $75 by 2030, right? At the moment, there are only 2 countries in the world that exceed $75, Switzerland and Sweden, right? So this is a huge challenge. Now, the reason why the IMF says that this is the most effective instrument is because it makes it costly to emit greenhouse gases. It provides incentives for energy users to shift to greener resources. It just changes the system of incentives to alter behaviors in ways that will allow us to invest in renewables, to focus on buying more energy efficient appliances, in giving up our guzzlers and moving to electric cars and so on. And also it's a measure that is easy to implement because you can embed it within the tax systems which already exist and which are already sort of taxing fuels, all right? Furthermore, you can collect revenue. That is one of the beauties of this tax, that according to the IMF calculations, you can collect somewhere between 1.6, something like around 1.6% of GDP on an annual basis. And these funds can be used, to all kinds of things. You can be used to climate change mitigation measures. They can be used in particular to cushion the impact of the rise in prices that comes as a result of the carbon taxes. This is a very, very important subject. I think one of the reasons why governments are very reluctant to introduce carbon taxes is because they don't have either they don't have the capacity or they don't have the patience to design the supporting measures that are necessary to protect the people that are most affected by these taxes, which tend to be the low-income groups, young people, the unemployed, and so on. So there is a political economy dimension here that is very important. But the reason why the French experiment of 2018 failed and brought the yellow jackets into the streets, it was because the government did not do enough preliminary work to manage the impact on low-income groups. A second area where we have done some work is the whole question of taxing financial transactions. The famous American economist James Tobin gave a talk in 1972 at Princeton University in which he proposed to tax foreign exchange transactions as a way of dumping and speculation. John Maynard Keynes, 36 years before, in 1936, had already identified what he called round-trip transactions, where traders, buy something in the morning and sell it in the afternoon or the following day. And this creates a lot of instability and speculation. And so, just to give you an idea of the magnitudes that we're talking about, when Tobin revisited his proposal in 1995, he said that foreign exchange trading at that time was something like $1.3 trillion per day, right? Which meant like over $300 trillion per year, which at that time was 67 times the volume of total exports, total international trade, right? So since 1995, when he gave that update, today, foreign exchange trading is $6.5 trillion per day, right? So because the global economy has grown, the financial system has become much more extensive and deeper. And so here we are talking about a large potential pocket of resources that could go towards financing this transition to renewable energy. A very tiny tax of something like 0.05%, could generate something like $800 billion per year, right? Which is 8 times the figure that the rich countries have promised to the low-income countries, right? So here is a potential source. Obviously, the banks hate the idea. Governments are somewhat intimidated by the lobbying that the financial sector players do. But again, the numbers are there, and this is a potentially very, very important source of revenue. Let me mention one additional one, which I think is somewhat ignored by policymakers. The IMF is actually a small world bank in its essence. In fact, coming out of Bretton Woods, many people thought that the people who participated in that conference in 1994 got the names wrong, that the IMF should have been called the World Bank because it is the one global institution that actually can issue liquidity. They can print money. There is a hybrid currency called the SDR, and the IMF has actually done a few SDR allocations over its history. A few tiny ones in the 70s and the 80s, and the first big one in 2009 during the global financial crisis in $250 billion. This is liquidity, it's free liquidity, unconditional liquidity, which is distributed to the member countries according to their participation in the capital of the organization. Well, just for you to know, because this is little notice. I mean, the IMF is a very complicated organization, and it's not the focus of a lot of attention. But on August the 2nd, a couple of months ago, the IMF Board of Governors did an SDR allocation of $650 billion. Okay, this is big money, and about 275 of that will end up in the hands of emerging markets and developing countries. For the first time, there is talk of maybe allowing the rich countries to pass on to the developing countries some of their SDR allocation as a way of providing assistance, facilitating, dealing with COVID, improving the public health systems, and funding climate change mitigation efforts. There are other options and ideas that are presented in the paper. One of them has to do with improving the efficiency of our tax systems. According to the IMF, tax havens cost governments, somewhere between $500 and $600 billion per year. 200 of that is actually accounted for by low-income countries. So my point here is that although we suffer and we discuss where is the money going to come from, I think that in some sense, we have to create this awareness that the problem is not lack of money. The problem is not absence of resources. The problem more fundamentally is an issue of political will, an issue of governments basically getting their act together and doing the kinds of things which would generate the resources to finance this transition to renewable energy. The alternative is inertia and a much darker outlook for humanity as a result of climate change and its associated calamities. Let me stop here. There is more, but there is a paper that will be put on the website of the Global Challenges Foundation that is 50 pages long and that goes into a great more detail and provides more substance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto. Then Arthur, may we next hear from you, please?
And thank you. Well, I'd like to take this a step further in looking at how we might specifically look at global environmental governance, particularly as it relates to the problems of climate change, and what kind of structures we really need at the global level to be at the scale of the problem that we're facing. And I'm reporting here on a paper we prepared also for the Climate Governance Commission in collaboration with Sylvia Carlson-Venkhuizen of Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And we've already seen how environmental problems have globalized. We have, of course, climate change. Well, that's why we're here at COP26 to address this as an issue. So no point in going into the details. Everybody knows the problems we have with climate change, but biodiversity loss is both impacting and being impacted by climate change and is also extremely threatening. We have, of course, problems of pollution and waste, including air pollutants that contribute to global warming and many other serious impacts on humans and nature. Those are sort of three major problems. There are many others, but together they represent existential threats to our future. Separately already, but even more together because they're interacting with each other. And there'll be impacts that we can never step back from. I mean, already with climate change, the latest science says that we'll probably not be able to slow acidification of the oceans and sea level rise maybe for hundreds of thousands of years. So we're looking at things that they may seem slow now, but they're going to go on and impact for a long time. On top of that, we have irreversible tipping points that seem to be very clear, very near. And once we go over the edge of some of those, again, problems will accelerate and coming back will become almost impossible. So only the most urgent action to transform our economies and our society might avoid a catastrophic future. Of course, that's not what politicians like to hear. The last things they want to face is some urgent major changes that they have to face in society with all of its potential impacts. Of course, as an environmental scientist and a former international official, I've been warning of this for more than 50 years. But so even saying it so long ago doesn't really make much of a difference in terms of where we're going. But of course, part of the problem is that while these problems have globalized, governance has not, to the scale and with the acceleration of the problems. They're going faster and faster, and we're still creeping along, as we see with mechanisms like COP26. Our system gives primacy to national sovereignty. which has left global efforts entirely voluntary. But national sovereignty is already greatly eroded in a globalized economy and society dominated by the wealthiest and most powerful countries. So, the idea of sovereignty is already, much weaker than it may have been, 50, 100 years ago. So what's needed today is how to protect our national autonomy. And the only way we can do that is through stronger global governance. Our great crisis today really is implementation. We have all these agreements, from the Sustainable Development Goals to the Paris Agreement and many other conventions. Governments are good at signing things, but we have failures to protect the public good, because while you sign things, you don't have to implement them. Governments can always ignore or opt out of global agreements, as the US did out of the climate agreements under the last administration. There's no enforcement. Sovereignty too often serves as a shield to hide the misdeeds of national leaders, not to mention the power of vested interests and lobbies or corrupt systems. The result is a failure of trust, because governments are not trustworthy, hindering global agreement and collaboration. The big challenge in COP26 is trying to build enough trust to really move forward. At the national level, we accept principles of governance for the common good, with institutions that define our national identity as a head of state and an executive, a legislature or parliament to pass laws, mechanisms for implementation and enforcement, and processes for judicial review. At the national level, respect for the law is the norm, and lawbreakers are punished in the common interest. Protecting our individual freedom and autonomy includes protection from the threats of others. We must now extend the same principles of governance to the global level. Our Earth is our only home, and it is in extreme danger. Environmental threats do not respect national boundaries. Humans are now the dominant species, and our oneness and our need to build a just and harmonious global civilization are now obvious, requiring united action. The urgency of the climate crisis, among others, leaves no time for the present laborious pace of intergovernmental negotiation, requiring consensus, pushing the lowest common denominator, or agreements undertaken voluntarily, as with international conventions, which allow free riders who benefit without making any effort. This is no way to preserve our global common interest as defined by the latest science. So climate change may be the best opportunity for a breakthrough in global governance, as the science is so obvious and the threat so immediate. This is our chance to create an institution like a global environment agency for those critical environmental issues of the common good that require urgent and effective action by all states, multinational corporations, and other actors. We've explored in our paper some of the details of this, and I want to share a few key points here as we look at this possibility. So what might be the design criteria and functions for such an institution as a global environment agency? First, clearly, knowledge provision. We need the capacity to determine the planetary environmental boundaries and system requirements based on the best science, with reinforced and integrated scientific advisory processes. We have the IPCC for climate, we have one for biodiversity, we have some elements, but they're not looking at the whole global picture. We need deliberative and legislative function, with the authority to adopt binding legislation on the respect of those limits, and to determine through consultative processes the just distribution of responsibilities based on historic and actual contributions. So everybody must see that everybody is doing their part and doing their fair share of the effort that is needed. We need an enabling and implementing function with capacities to enforce those responsibilities on states and other actors, and the means to assist those that lack the necessary capacities and competences. Poor developing countries don't have the resources to do everything that is needed. They need assistance. This to be included as part of the reflection. We need a trust and justice building function with mechanisms to enable judicial review of interpretations and settlement of disputes as necessary. And then we need what we call a learning and reflexivity function, because we need to be able to adapt to the complexity and uncertainty of the global environment, learning from past experience and present environmental change, to keep abreast of our evolving global situation with inevitable surprises. We don't understand the complex system. We have to be able to adapt our governance quickly as these new issues arise, as we saw with the pandemic. There are already many available institutions and capacities within the UN system and beyond that could contribute to global governance of climate change and other pressing global environmental challenges. The aim, therefore, would not be a massive global bureaucracy, but an orchestrator with global authority over polynodal processes and institutions, with an emphasis on subsidiarity. It would be like an orchestra conductor who decides on a score to play and leads many instruments to produce harmonious music. The agency should have the authority to adopt global rules, norms, and values that would ensure the safeguarding of the planetary environment for the common good, as well as the right of everyone to a clean, safe, and productive human environment, as just agreed by the Human Rights Council. It should be endowed with adequate supervision authority to ensure the necessary rules are followed. We could build on UNEP and the UN Environment Assembly, which already have many relevant competencies, but they are under-resourced and can only catalyze and coordinate, not legislate and enforce. The agency could collaborate with, build coherence between, and eventually incorporate the relevant international conventions, like the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The agency's position within the UN system will depend on whether there are wider UN reforms, which might give, for example, legislative authority to the General Assembly, or binding judicial capacity to the International Court of Justice. In their absence, granting such authority more narrowly to an institution to act on the planetary environmental crisis may be more politically acceptable. States, of course, would need to give up some sovereignty for these well-defined global issues in the common good. But this would be balanced by guarantees of national autonomy in their implementation through processes that build trust. We saw this with the European Union, which started with a coal and steel community. And gradually, when people saw that worked, they gave up a little more and a little more, leading to the European Union as we see it today. This would be the most practical step to ensure the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement and even the Sustainable Development Goals. There are many further details in the paper that we prepared for the Climate Governance Commission, which we published very shortly. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Arthur. And in terms of your affiliation, you're the founder of the International Environment Forum, right?
Yes.
So next, for the next panelist, we return to Glasgow and to Haldor, who's sitting next to me. Haldor, please.
Thank you, Joachim, and good to be with you, both those that are here and those that connect in from afar. I'll be taking a bit different perspective, taking the story further, I just so you kind of can place my reflection in context. I've worked on the design and elaboration of global governance when I was serving as an international civil servant, and worked on the conceptions around the Paris Agreement. But I've now moved to national implementation, and this has given me a helpful insight into some of the things that emerge through learning by doing exercise. And the urgency of the climate challenge is such that, in my view, we do not have time for much redesign at this moment. We really need to move forward with what we have and make it work. And so I will share some reflections on how that it could be done, and I'll be focusing there on this cohesion between the global and the local or national. And that is something that is critically important for if one wants to mobilize change agents and mobilize the transition towards something that is more desirable than what we have today. And some of it's been mentioned already that we already have a major disconnect, let's be honest, between what goes on at the national level and then the global level. And many leaders can come to platforms like here in Glasgow and are not necessarily accountable back home. Or feeling that they are somehow bringing their nations with them. And so I will share some reflections on kind of how we could change that dynamic. But I also wanted to remind ourselves that the design of the Paris Agreement itself sought to address this disconnect by combining what could be called a bottom-up driven movement forward versus top-down approach. And I don't want to go into that discussion here, but basically the Paris Agreement combines the two by coming up with an agreement that is objective driven, but then mobilizes national determined contribution. And it's really important not to just say NDCs, because then we miss the point here. But it's also important to understand that these are contributions to an objective. They're not something abstract. But what has and we have seen is very challenging to actually have these long-term global concerns, and all of the speakers already have addressed this trade-off between shorter-term national interests and the global common good. And how can we move forward on that? And part of that has to do with developing a national narrative, developing your place in the overall effort. And that is something that doesn't come automatically. It's challenging for many countries. Let's be honest, in some countries, you basically have to redesign the economy because there are important sectors that are not compatible with where we need to go. And the best example of that would be the mining of coal. That is something that is something that has to be. So in some countries are really faced with major structural adjustments to their economies, which is always challenging for leaders. And the most powerful response to that is to focus on opportunities and the opportunity framing. And that is more, but that's easier said than done. And that's where the trust has to be built. That can only be done through national consultative processes where you basically develop just transition pathways with the people that are affected. And so that's a hugely challenging undertaking. But I just wanted to submit to you that one ingredient, and by the way, I really want to underline this is not a panacea, it's not the key solution, but I wanted to share with you a potential role of national advisory councils in developing that national narrative. And when I returned back to my native Iceland, I was asked to chair a national climate council, and there are many countries that have done this. And I'm very happy to share with you that yesterday a group of such councils, and I can pass around here, this announcement, formed a network, basically to learn from each other, to learn what works and how one can do this. And the aspiration is that these advisory councils can become bridges or bridge builders between the global and the national, but also bridges between facts and reality on one hand, and the aspirations of nations on the other. And the key point around the whole notion of opportunity framing is that you actually visualize a better future. And you focus on, you bring the people with you by focusing on not what they need to stop doing, but what they need to start doing. And this is particularly powerful when you really start innovating. And innovation is, as you know, is not just about technology; it's also about business models and kind of bringing this kind of cohesion to move forward. But I wanted to end by bringing it back to this whole notion of unity of mankind, because that is something that is a very challenging notion to internalize. And COVID helped us on this. And I would say that I would really encourage you, if you haven't done so, to listen to the Queen's speech yesterday, where she distinguished between statesmanship and political maneuvering. And this is where we really need to be moving now. And I think there is real hope. I do believe that in the human capacity, this will not be easy. That's not what I'm saying, but it's extremely important that we maintain faith in the future. We kind of have that kind of power to overcome difficulties. And maybe we can end by my favorite quote from Nelson Mandela, that it appears impossible until it's done. Thank you.
Thank you for that optimism that we need so much, Albert. Thank you. Thank you. Next, we will move online again to Ava. And Ava, maybe you can share your background also a bit with us.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. My only affiliation and credibility is that I'm a senior in high school who is very passionate about this concept of global climate government, especially. And through this, I've just been so lucky to get to work on a documentary about it and to interact with incredibly cool adults because of my interest in this concept. And this idea of visualizing our better future and that things are impossible until they're done just flows so perfectly into what I was planning to talk about. Because as a youth who is interested in this, over the past couple of years, I've really gotten to see the main obstacle in our way to gathering the will of the general public, and especially the youth, who are the amplifiers of this message. So I wanted to talk about what's the obstacle to get the will to actually achieve and work towards this vision. So our culture is now more than ever a culture of glorifying the cynic. The idealist is not often cherished or encouraged to live out this idealism. As they grow older, cynicism is mistaken for maturity and clear-mindedness, and thus makes them an adult. And an adult is one who can discern, one who's realistic with their goals and aspirations. Except now our idea of being realistic, especially as an adult, is closer to cynicism on the broad spectrum of belief than it really ever has been. This cynicism, or what we call realpolitik in the adult world, is considered the most intelligent. Except we need idealism now more than ever. But I've started to realize it's not even idealism we need. We just need to change our idea of what it means to be realistic. Because if I said to you right now, be realistic, the connotation would not be positive. And I'm sure any one of us would start listing off a long list of negatives of whatever we were discussing, in order to be realistic. So we need to redefine what realism is as a mindset that looks at an issue, sees a solution, and maps out a way to achieve that solution without kicking the feet out from under it before we even begin. When I was first asked to speak on this panel of incredibly credible people, I really worried about my contribution and any value it could provide. But as a pretty average and simply curious youth, I decided that I'd look at the issue most prevalent in the extremely intelligent young people I have around me. And it is exactly this: cynicism. Not inherent cynicism, but cynicism born of their ideas being dismissed. Our thoughts shape our reality. And as a child, this was a phrase often repeated in my household. And as I grew older, I realized that the same phrase, repeated in other iterations, was considered somewhat cheesy and cliche by my peers, because what power could thought possibly have on changing the world? But this is exactly the misunderstanding. Our thoughts shape our reality doesn't mean we sit on a couch and simply think about changing the world around us. It means that we change the idea of knowledge from constantly being critical to searching for opportunities that could come to fruition with an open, curious, and determined mind. Because many major historical issues, almost all of them, and advancements before they have been solved, have felt impossible. But we're at the natural next step in our political and collective well-being, where we need global solutions to global problems like climate change, which Arthur said before, environmental problems do not respect national borders, and they cannot be solved at the level of a nation state. And that is always the phrase that has stood out to me ever since I read about the concept of global governance and fell in love with its potential, because what is the other option? Global governance, it's not an idea that is completely brand new. Like I said before, it is the natural step in our collective making of history. We started as individuals. We then formed family-based nomadic tribes. Skip forward in history, and these tribes came together as a collective to form the first settlements. Eventually, these small sedentary societies formed larger societies, civilizations, and empires, then city-states, and eventually nation-states. All of these evolutions came out of necessity, always in the face of new, bold, dangerous challenges that required new solutions. How did the US come together to form the United States? We already have the EU. Is this not an example of our collective power and potential? And this may sound like my young naivety that is speaking, but in reality, it's a realism I have been practicing adamantly with the help of intelligent adults around me. And I still occasionally lose hope because youth are holding on to hope with their fingertips at this point, because it is fleeting and hardly emphasized. But a good friend of mine recently called me a positive realist in a world of negative idealists, which sounds very confusing, but if you take anything away from my rambling, please let it be this term, positive realist. It took me a while to discern what exactly he meant by this, but I haven't stopped thinking about it since. A positive realist is someone who knows that solutions are embedded in every problem. Being realistic always equated to me the person who hears an idea and spots out all the things wrong with it. But a positive realist looks for opportunities that sound terrifying, big, and far away, and realize that solutions always feel that way. And for example, global governance is a perfect example. It is one of these scary solutions, one that kind of triggers the fear in one's heart because it seems so impossible. But a positive realist sees the enormity of that goal and realizes we've achieved its like over and over and over again in history. And the negative idealist is the voice in my head that I have to avoid. The voices in education or elevated conversation who praise a young person for their critical analysis of the world and the state of its affair, but laugh at their unachievable solutions. Because of this definition of intelligence, youth who have childlike idealism and adult-like strategy-focused minds don't get to bask in that unique station of youth, the energy that idealism brings to their strategy. So we have a dichotomy currently, a theory I've exhausted in every conversation I've ever had about youth, because as we introduce youth into the conversation of decision-making, it feels often like patting a child on the head. Youth come in and state their opinions with conviction and strength, but without direction. We speak in theories and broad concepts that are best said by youth, but we do not have direct solutions because we look to the decision makers and the policymakers for that. But the decision makers are waiting for the next generation to change the world. So we need to unify these two forces to get anything done. And global governance and global climate governance is a solution that the positive realist can see is necessary and near in our future. So how do we ignite this idea in the hearts of our amplifiers, youth? And how do we lead their protests to a global solution rather than just global problems? And it goes back to my parents' favorite phrase, which I hear repeatedly, which is our thoughts change our reality, yes, but our thoughts are actually our reality. We have to change the minds, especially of young people who have been conditioned to believe that being a negative idealist or being a cynic is intelligence. So how do we start where we are and map out ways to get to this new vision as our ancestors always have? How do we, adults and youth alike, change our culture of glorifying the cynic if we do not strive towards solving these global solutions in new and uncharted ways, then what are we left with? Well, we are left with a stagnant society, the one we currently have. And it isn't an inherently horrible society. It is filled with beautiful and inherently good people, a phrase that would immediately be considered unrealistic. But those who have been wronged by a system of injustice, dirties as inherent nature, and we are left with hurt and angry humans operating within a system that puts all the responsibility on the individual in the midst of global crises. And we are left with the most incredible and inspiring people that I'm so honored to know, the youth that surround me and outnumber my knowledge tenfold, but have not been taught how to harvest it, wrought with anxiety about the future, but glued to their feet to a single spot because they believe nothing is achievable, nothing is possible, and nobody's listening. And maybe that is true, but if we believe that, we stop fighting and our realities never change. When I first started speaking and got this opportunity to speak as a youth in these types of forums, I had always thought that all we needed was intergenerational cooperation at the surface, forums where youth and adults alike could come together in a spirit of mutual respect. But now I realize the issue is deep-seated in all of our psyches, because we need to start glorifying new definition of being realistic, being the positive realist. So to finish off my portion, which I hope has been useful, this is kind of my task that I'm starting to strive towards, which is we. And when I say we, I mean adults, because I'm there very soon, sadly, have an immense and wonderful and exciting opportunity to change the mindset of those around us, to create the will to achieve this vision, to set a new standard for our activists and for ourselves, to train our minds to go back to this new definition of what being realistic means, to create the next generation of positive realists in opportunities for youth that reroute their thinking, that guide them towards a common vision, no matter how unrealistic it may seem, because global governance and global climate governance is where we need to head. And it can be this common vision that youth bring to bring humanity to its next stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your positive realism, Ava. So then, Wendy, may we please hear from you next?
Thank you. I'm not sure you need to hear from me next. After that, I'll do my best. I'm Wendy Momin. I'm currently chair of the National Alliance of Women's Organizations here in the UK, and I'm also a member of Soroptimist International. And both of these organizations focus on women, and that is really what I wanted to focus on today as well. We're talking about the governance of climate change and very high level processes. But I also want to focus on a cohort of human beings who are more than half the population of the world, to show how their participation at the grassroots and in these high-level positions can bring the kind of realism that Ava was just speaking about to some of the processes that we're seeing today, and to some of the things that we're trying to establish. We know that the consequences of climate change are very severe. The whole COP process has been talking about that. And people everywhere are aware of, to a certain degree, of the kinds of things that can happen to them in their homes when climate change is not abated. It's particularly a challenge for those who are affected by poverty, food insecurity, lack of access to education, healthcare, or clean water, and by the very prejudices that limit their full exercise of access to those rights, and for whom climate change has already had a negative impact on their lives and livelihoods. And this affects women and girls to a larger degree than perhaps we know. One of the most widespread and pervasive social challenges that affects communities around the world is the marginalization of women and girls. And we've just heard from Ava how the voice of young people is not heard. It's not only their voice that is not heard, their very selves are not seen to be worthy of even having food in their mouths, or education in their lives, or access to sanitation, or the other things that would enable them to participate more effectively in their communities. And yet around the world, women and girls are largely responsible for securing the very food that we eat, for water and energy, for cooking and heating. And the scarcity of resources that arise from climate change intensifies their burden, and at the very least leaves them very little time for other undertakings. I mean, for girls, leaves them very little time to go to school and get an education. For women who have families, little time left after attending to these matters, which are more challenging these days, little time to find perhaps a job that will bring them an income, or to develop an entrepreneurship that will enable other women also to participate in the economic resources of their own community. We know also that things like natural disasters and natural occurrences also take a very heavy toll on women and girls, largely because in many parts of the world, they have little access to information about what they need to do, very little access to the resources that might assist them. And in some cases, they are trapped in their own homes at these times. Perhaps they cannot drive. Perhaps they don't know how to swim in a river to get away from something. Perhaps they are unable to even to leave their own home. So as families are trying to cope with these changes, they also may resort to very negative solutions to their problems. For example, forcing girls to leave school and to walking even further to collect firewood or water. They may resort to selling their girls. We've had an example of that very recently, this very week, or to increased trafficking, leaving them vulnerable to increased trafficking, and which all of these things, of course, also increase gender-based violence. So climate change threatens the basic human rights, such as the right to life, the right to a standard of living that is adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, which includes a right to having food and clothing and housing, medical assistance, and so on, including, of course, an education. And these rights are already very difficult for women to achieve in many places in the world, and climate change exacerbates the disparity with men. So recognizing the climate crisis as a human rights issue is central, I believe, to efforts to create a sustainable, gender equal future, one in which women's rights are recognized as human rights, and that every woman and every girl is able to achieve her full potential. In such a world, every woman, every girl would have access to all the resources they need and are represented equally with men in spaces where decisions about lives are being made. Of course, the world I want to see is one that everyone has access to those things, where everyone has the measure of wealth that would enable them to achieve all the potential that they have, whether that is intellectual potential, the potential to work, spiritual potential, its potential to achieve not only what they want, but what the world itself requires. Climate change disrupts communities as well as individual lives and families. So agriculture and fishing are disrupted, food security insecurity is increased. And as I said, it requires women and girls in many parts of the world to spend more time getting the very resources they need to provide for their families. Climate change also affects women and girls differently than men in another way. And this is because there is a gendered division of labor, cultural restrictions, and certain social restrictions and roles that make women's work less secure, bars them from taking on roles that might improve their situation, and exposes girls, particularly and young women, but all women really, to sexual exploitation and trafficking. Indeed, in whatever area of life one looks at, from the economic stability to maternal health care to education, women and girls are generally worse off and are negatively impacted by climate change. But it would be a mistake to think of women and girls as simply victims or unresourced members of the society. They represent, in my view, one of the greatest sources of untapped potential in the global effort to overcome climate change and other environmental problems. Their responsibilities in families, in the communities, whether they're as farmers or people who look after nature, have uniquely positioned them to develop the strategies that are needed to adapt to climate change and environmental conditions. They are used to caring for other people. They are used to making do and mending. They are used to finding creative ways to solve their own problems, and they're collaborative. They work with each other at the neighborhood level. I'm not saying men don't do this. I'm just saying women have a longer, perhaps, direct experience of doing this. They're the buffer often when social services fail to step in and take on the caring role. We have seen that, especially in our country, through COVID, where it was the mothers who left their jobs to enable their children to be able to be educated through Zoom, this kind of a platform, on the one telephone that the family had. They found a way to do that. I also want to just pay tribute to the traditional knowledge of Indigenous women around the world, which can be particularly useful for developing locally based responses to the effects of climate change. We have ignored that wisdom for far too long, and yet these are people whose generations have survived in very difficult and challenging conditions for thousands of years. Women's distinct knowledge and needs, of course, complement those of men, and they need to be taken into consideration together. It is through consultation, collaboration with one another that we can devise these strategies, not only for climate change, but for many other issues that are currently facing humanity, for migration, for the pandemic that we are all facing at the moment. So my proposal, and that of many women's organizations, such as the National Alliance of Women's Organizations and the Soroptimists, is that the governmental and international levels need to include more women in the formulation of disaster preparedness and response plans. They need to incorporate their knowledge and their lived experience to ensure that such plans include not only the particular needs of women and girls, but they are also closely aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals, that they have an application for healthy families and communities, and of course nations, which are also required to take those views into account if they are to survive.
Thank you
So,
very much. Thank you.
Sorry?
Thank you very much.
Okay, I just have one more sentence, if I can just say my last sentence.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So instead of dismissing women as unimportant, we should be including the voice of them in all of our human endeavors, so as to create the social conditions in which the most fruitful collaboration and innovation can take place. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Wendy, especially because recently I saw a ranking of what would be the measures that would have the biggest impacts on cutting emissions. And carbon capture and storage was mentioned, renewable energy, energy efficiency. But what really came out on top was empowering women and girls, education for women and girls, and family planning together. Those measures together could have the biggest impact on cutting emissions actually into the future, interestingly. So with that, and before we go to questions here from the room and also questions that you asked online in the chat, I would like to ask the 5 panelists that we still have with us to help me out a bit. Because what I would like to do here next is to make a brief list of action points, a to-do list, let's say. So imagine we were going after this meeting to the COP venue, just a few miles from here, and we would be handing a list of 5 action points to the world leaders that are assembling there at the moment. I wanted to ask each of our panelists to share with me one idea that they have heard in the past hour or so. Because we heard so many good ideas, and I would really like to boil them down a bit. It doesn't have to be an idea from yourself, but it could also be an idea that you've heard from the other panelists. Augusto had to leave us a bit earlier, so maybe I can start with you, Maya, especially as you work with the Climate Governance Commission of the Global Challenges Foundation. So yes.
I have 23 different proposals.
Exactly.
So, it wouldn't be one thing. I would ask. I would invite them to read the report, to think about this exponential policy thinking, to think in this different way of, this intellectual interrogation of, we have the solutions, we have these policies that we know are so vital for driving implementation action of the Paris Agreement goals. So why is this that we have this solution action gap, the policy gap, and then the global governance gap, just to invite this sort of intellectual exploration without pressure, but just to really try to think in different ways. How can we really scale up exponential action, and how can we support the Paris Agreement with near-term supporting platforms and coalitions and strengthen what we have now, and then think ahead also to what do we need. As Arthur was saying, we have this unprecedented planetary situation that we have to think in completely different ways, and to start to plan ahead to really think about in the medium term, in the longer term, what global governance architecture do we need? And policymakers, decision makers should have also the space to just reflect, personally reflect, quietly reflect within themselves, have safe spaces for open conversations also about these. So the fears around some of the changes that need to be made, at the national level, the policies, there can be a really good discussion around these things. So I guess it would be to think in different ways, to please be very invited to read the report, and then to keep engaging in these dialogues, so that we can work together to have this hopeful and proactive attitude that Ava was so beautifully eloquent in sharing.
Thank you, Maya. Arthur, what would be your one idea that you think is personally feasible and interesting to hand to the world leaders?
I think the most essential in the framework of the COP itself. And Well, I realized that, it's not going to be the easiest thing to do, but it's something to go beyond the consensus rule. Adopt some kind of procedure for weighted majority voting so that 1 or 2 countries cannot block all progress at the global level within this framework. When I came back from the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, I was on the train with the Swiss delegation, and they were telling me how one country in the discussion they were in would always, at the last minute, come back and say, we want to go all over again. They were an oil-producing country. They wanted to be guaranteed to have no reduction in their economy if we had to use less oil. And they're holding out for that, blocking all other progress. So we need to get a much maturity in our global system to find some other way of taking decisions that does not allow one minority to hold all the rest of the world hostage to their self-interest. I think if it's possible to get a breakthrough in the rules within the COP Environment Convention, that would already open the door to a lot more progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. And Holder, which ideal action do you think is most enticing?
Well, for me, it's actually more of an appeal than a suggestion. Is to actually muster the courage to demonstrate statesmanship, and that is something that has to come from that courage, that ambition has to come from some kind of a real desire to change the status quo. And so my sense is that what is now needed more than ever is leadership, but that leadership is more a leadership in actually making things happen on the ground in the best interests of their people and future generations.
Thank you. And Ava, what is your positively realist idea that you picked up?
Well, it's just a combination. It's not a very groundbreaking idea, just a combination of what you all have shared, but just that the conversation has to go beyond, I guess, beyond academia, and like Wendy was saying, involve all these segments of society that are often suppressed, so that the general public is educated on these topics, so they can have the will to move forward, I guess, tying mine in at the end. But just having this conversation in all segments of society, which is such a abstract idea, but stands true throughout time.
Thank you. And I think what you say is really important, because governance in the end is human business, it's people's business. And we often talk about it in the abstract and about mechanisms, institutions, but in the end, things also have to work person to person. So looking beyond the academic ideas, looking also at other dimensions of being human, the emotional side, the spiritual side, that is super important. And finally, Wendy, what would you recommend the world leaders to do? And I'm saying world leaders, of course, to make more enticing this idea, but what would you recommend all of us to do or to look at?
Well, I would recommend them to listen to the people on this panel with their ideas. That would be number one. I would also ask them to ask their mothers what their mothers, their wives, their children think, the women in their lives, and to engage them in those conversations at the real level as well.
That's beautiful. Thanks so much. So the next, I would like to open up the floor here, open up the room and see if there's any questions, further ideas from the room. I see here, yes, please, sir.
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, for
I think you can use the microphone, if this works. I think yes, it works. Please.
Well, thank you, first
And maybe you can also introduce yourself, sorry.
I'm sorry, yes, I just wanted to thank you for a very stimulating and important discussion. And I've got two questions. One I'm putting for Kristen, if somebody else might like to take it up, which is, first of all, on the financial architecture, whether you've got a response to Rajan's proposal for a global climate levy. I don't know whether you've seen this proposal, have a levy that people, countries that have emissions above the global average pay an amount corresponding to equal per capita amount for hot. Countries who are below the per capita average, they receive a levy from that, so you get automatic ban transfer, which incentivizes carbon reduction. So anyone who's responsible for that, very interesting. Secondly, question for Maya is whether there's a case for having, if you like, more communities are willing, like the European Union and small group of countries getting together to form more binding accelerated action to demonstrate it is possible to move forward faster and to create and demonstrate how a virtuous circle of economy of carbon reduction can be created, whether that would make a significant question about consensus decision making.
Great questions. Firstly, on that global climate levy.
Sorry, Maya, we couldn't actually hear the question. Just a brief summary would be helpful.
Okay, I can do that. You want me to?
Please.
Yeah. So firstly, it was asked about this proposal for a global climate levy on countries which have emissions, disproportionate emissions above a certain level. And secondly, the potential of sort of collections of countries of the virtuous, the ambitious, coming together to sort of drive international climate ambition. Both excellent points. In terms of the levy, I think I might have seen it in passing previously, and I will share it with Augusto so he can add it to his set of proposals that he's been working on and will hopefully continue to be engaged with. But maybe after I answer the second question, Arthur, do you want to say something about that? Because you often raise sort of the justice dimension in terms of global emissions, and also that kind of levy with basically a financial penalty would be a sort of enforcement mechanism, right? So Arthur, I don't know if you want to say a few words about that, but just before you start, Arthur, I'll just mention a few thoughts on this alliance of the virtuous. We touch on this at multiple points in this report, because indeed, with our current global governance architecture, the consensus rule, countries are starting to try to do that. There are a lot of, the ad hoc alliances in very important areas like, international finance ministers from countries around the world that Chile and others have been pioneering, for example, to try to move ahead and have action and also have like a peer support kind of network to improve policies. But these alliances around different issues, Denmark also an incredible initiative with Costa Rica, Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, to proactively phase out fossil fuel exploration, and they're trying to build that alliance. So there are indeed alliances of countries trying to be bold and quite ambitious. And the report mentions at various points, Joachim made a contribution on this notion of climate clubs, where countries can together indeed form collaborations around key actions, in relation to trade or price on carbon. And we indeed encourage, please, countries, but we see this tendency of these multiplying sort of alliances without them connecting with each other. Sometimes they're duplicating each other. And then also, it's a paper by Jimena Leiva Roche. She talks about how there isn't enough monitoring to make sure that these types of action coalitions of countries really deliver on the action and implement it, rather than just talking shops, that they really, as Haldor was mentioned, focus on implementation. And there's really kind of, more strict requirements to become members of such advanced action coalitions. So indeed, this is a fruitful area, but there has to be strengthening of this kind of approach. Arthur, do you want to talk about the climate levy?
Well, I think the principle sounds nice. The problem is making it work. First of all, you would need to have some consensus on what are excess emissions. And would it be on a per capita basis? Would it be, where would you define excess between things that are, because different countries have different situations, and something that may be essential to meet the needs of the poor in one country would be simply an expression of luxury consumption by the rich in another country. And so there would need to be some consensus on precisely how you would define what was excess in order to levy such a tax. The other point I would make is that you would certainly want to make certain you were not only taxing countries, so to speak, but also corporations. And when you look at the enormous responsibility of multinational corporations for major parts of the global emissions, it might make more sense to start with a global excess tax on corporate emissions. Building on the principle just adopted now, this 15%, global corporate tax on profits. So already there's a step forward in saying we have to be taxing corporations at the global level. So the next step might be to come up with a global tax on corporate emissions, because they are, that would be a much stronger motivation for them to change their behavior, to change their corporate plans, and many other things. So just two ideas with respect to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Haldor.
Just, I just wanted to draw attention to that this coalition building is a very important part of what's happening now in global governance, and this was part of also there was a step change in that in Paris, where there was much more focus on action and cooperative action and joining. I just wanted to mention two things that are just very recent development, that the United States have now rejoined the High Ambition Coalition, which was key in Paris to get the 1.5 into the outcome. And then today there's a major announcement on a coalition working on halting deforestation and accelerating regeneration of tropical rainforest, not just tropical rainforest, also boreal, very importantly in Russia. And this is something that the UK government has been working on for quite some time, and that's a fairly major announcement. So that's a very big part of how things are now happening. And I think it's also important for us to realize that almost everything that needs to be negotiated has been negotiated. Let's be clear. So for example, and so there are a couple of things that they need to come to an agreement on here, but this is not so much a negotiation moment. This is very much a delivery moment. And delivery happens very much through joining forces on specific things. And that is something, and in terms of the worry that Maya had, which is correct, that there is a lack of kind of quantification on this. There is a fairly major initiative that is very active at this meeting here that is attempting to bridge that gap in quantifying the delivery of these initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Haldor. I think, yes, there is another question there, please.
My name is John Glasgow. I work with question for Arthur. Specifically, paper by hand, that's probably others. Is that what we really need to do is move from sectors and decision makers. Just a question for Arthur. And on the question here, the network of national councils, across the use of the world, approach that network to consider climate problems.
Again, we couldn't hear the question, so perhaps it could be
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can rephrase it or summarize it. So, and this question is for Arthur. How can we move basically right from the current consensus-based model to a majority decision-making?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, there was a paper in 2010 that already brought up this idea. And what has changed then in the past 11 years that could be different or would increase the chance for moving towards majority decision making on climate change?
I think, of course, the big challenge is that any such change requires consensus of everybody. And therefore, any one person, any one country can block any move from that. We see that not only internationally, but nationally. There, all of those distortions to governance that allow certain people to have more power or more authority or to prevent change that might be bad for them, is weakening governance at all levels. We see that we can see that in the American Senate and many other places as well. So that it's trying to find some way of getting around that need to get everybody to agree to a change in rules that is going to be bad for any one of them. They all see the advantage of holding on to that leverage over everybody else as part of their negotiating strategy. So what really needed is a recognition that the principle of justice is so much more important than self-interest. That, and hopefully that maybe that might say the urgency of climate change and the disasters that are coming are so powerful that one could pressure those few countries holding out, to agree to make the change in return for willing to listen to them very carefully for the things that they're losing. And I think if they can be assured that that with a change in rules, they will still be guaranteed that they'll be listened to and their concern will be taken into account and listened to in a just way, perhaps one could, succeed in getting the change. But it's not going to be easy because so many are holding on to that because of the power it gives them. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Would you like to add something to that, Albert, from the National Climate Councils?
Yes, there was this question if this network of climate councils should be asked to advise on evolution of climate governance. My sense is that that would not be the right task for that network. And one thing to be clear here is that this is a kind of a learning network. This is sharing experiences and learning to accelerate progress. And I think it would be pulling things in the wrong direction, that these councils are very much focused on the national narrative and would not be the best to actually think of how to change the global arrangement. But if they are successful, they are changing the real world impact of what we have. And that's what I think we should always keep in mind. And when in my earlier life, when we were looking at different options in terms of moving forward, I always put this question: will the atmosphere see this? Will there be an impact at the end of the day? And that is something that I think we really have to be much more focused on, because we can be as busy bees, and we are very good at that. But what really, at the end of the day, we need to really be asking that question, that basically the so what question. Will the atmosphere see this, and will there be a real world benefit? So that's where I would go. But just to be clear, that these councils actually did send a letter to heads of government yesterday, where we appeal to suggest to them, to those that haven't established climate councils, to consider doing so. And we offer 5 kind of criteria for success. And just to summarize them, is this robust grounding in the latest climate science, a mandate to provide independent evidence-led advice and assessment of action by government, and also a remit, which is very important, to provide advice on the socioeconomic aspects and that look at fairness, and consultative and impartial approach in engaging stakeholders, and then a sharp focus on aligning adaptation, mitigation, and just transition, which are basically all 3 essential ingredients of effective climate action. So that's, I'll leave it here on the table if you want to look at the councils. But just give you a sense, it's Australia, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Denmark, Finland, Greece, Guatemala, Iceland, France, Ireland, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, and United Kingdom.
Sounds very promising. Yeah. And I hope other councils will also join the network. Just the beginning of
I'll just mention on this amazing topic of national climate councils, which indeed this is a crucial gap. It's a global governance gap because it's a gap between national awareness, policy, implementation of international goals that countries have signed on to. So this is such a vital linkage. And now I think there's about 49 or so countries around the world in every region that has some kind of climate, there's varying degrees of efficacy, and you've spelled out, really the core elements. So, and just to say, there's a paper by the Climate Governance Commission. It's a slightly longer paper, about 30 or 40 pages, by a Swedish academic, Karen Backstrand, and a colleague doing a comparative study. So this is extremely promising and an amazing initiative of governments.
And yesterday there was a new report also from World Resources Institute looking at the same, and also the European Environment Agency commissioned work by ITRI and Ecologic, which is a German think tank, earlier in the year looking at this. So it's a very dynamic area.
Then maybe next I can pick up on a question that I saw online, and which is about one of the, where you have a long discussion about climate change with other experts in climate change. Often what you end up with when you talk about what's holding us back, what's a real barrier, it's not so much the technological barriers or the physiological barriers, but it's more about political will. So that's always what people end up with. And then I'm always wondering, what is political will? So the question online was whether what we are lacking, is it the political will of the leaders, or is it about the political will of regular people, of citizens? And maybe Ava, from a youth perspective, what do you see? Do we need more political will from leaders? Do we need it more from citizens, from your neighbors, from young people? Where is the lack of political will? What do you think?
Well, I think the lack of will in general is on all sides, because we don't see, or we're not willing to see such a supposedly big solution as anything that is achievable. But I think really, I saw something similar in the chat as a next step of these wonderful idealistic visions, especially that I was talking about, because they were very hypothetical and abstract, is in terms of political will from the general public, is taking these protests that are kind of in a state of kinesis right now. They're very scattered, important, but scattered in their aims. And directing it into a single vision. And I see this vision as that of global governance. So really, I think it comes down to education on the grassroots level about the paths we can take forward. So we aren't just stuck discussing the issues of the day, but rather, since it's such and Maya was talking about this at the beginning, since it's such a immediate issue we have to deal with, very logistically, how we educating the public on how we move forward.
Thank you. And thank you, Ava, because you just made my task a lot easier by asking the next question that was indeed in the chat, which was, how do we put all these beautiful ideas into practice? Maybe Wendy, maybe I can ask you, from what you've been hearing over the past 90 minutes, what do you think could be some ways to put those ideas into practice and to really have the impact on the atmosphere that Haldor was mentioning?
Yes, thank you. My own feeling and belief is that the way we have to work at every level. So we work at the level of the individual and the family and the community and the neighborhood and the wider society and our local government. We've seen, for example, how states and the United States have taken much bolder steps towards climate change and other issues as well than perhaps the federal government there has done. That's also true here in the UK, where individual cities and towns have done more than perhaps national politicians might do. And so that same thing needs to work up through the various systems until we come to the global system. And I think this hasn't, one of the issues is exactly the question that was asked before around will. What we haven't got is a system that people now find credible and believable. And our information is coming through social media, which is distorted and is at the mercy of people who are climate change deniers or vaccination deniers or whatever it is, who have the freedom of speech to be able to give distorted understandings, which distorts people's abilities to act properly and to act not only in the interest of the world, but in their own best interests. So somehow those kinds of things have to also be considered when we talk about education. The systems themselves are not adequate for that. But I do believe that a wider consultation with ordinary people at two levels, one to inform, but also the other one is to engage them in the discussion and to have confidence that among those people are also wise people, and enabling them to engage in platforms like this with people of capacity and knowledge will enable them not only to share their ideas, but also to learn and be honored to do so. So it's something around honoring people as well.
Thank you, Wendy, especially for mentioning learning and education. And it also makes me think of a course that I took not a few years ago, 20 years ago, at the National Baha'i Center in London, which was a personal development course in a sense. And we learned that in general, there's 3 levels for getting something done. And that is to know, to love, and to will. So first, you know something, you understand what climate change is, you understand what the solutions are, but you need more than that. To know is not enough. You also need to love to do it and to like doing it, to love the planet and to love humanity. And then the next stage is to will, to want to do it, to really implement it. So I think you put those elements nicely together there.
Can I just add that you need to act as well?
Of course, absolutely, yeah. That's what we often forget. Yeah, that's an issue. So I would first like to see if there's any other questions in the room based on what you have just heard. Any thoughts, reflections? Sure.
I think that's it was mentioned in the beginning, we haven't really touched on it, but the need for unity on a vast scale, not just persons, but the unity of nations and people, unity of how nature, we are part of nature, we value it, we are forgotten that we are. But if we damage nature, we damage our whole bodies. We have to see the unity of the ecosystem. You're part, you're not separate. So yes, indeed, unity on all levels is something that we really need to strive for. And that is greatly in terms of the unity of peoples, of faiths, of religions, of cultures, and the richness that we need to turn away from ourselves and actually look at what we are about to lose. What we are about to lose is the experience of life on earth. And that's what I do.
Very powerful, yes. Do you have any question related to that? Sir? Okay, so I will summarize that. The sir in the room mentioned the need for unity on a vast scale and also the unity with nature. And then the importance of unity at all levels, including at the level of religions and cultures, and to be aware of what we would be about to lose if we have catastrophic climate change.
Could ask does that bring an optimistic feeling about
So the question is about the recent decision in the Human Rights Council, which adopted which recognized the principle of a clean environment as a human right, and is also thinking about actually a reporter to the Human Rights Council on the environment as human right. You've been following that discussion, Maya?
Not extremely closely, but I can
Yeah.
make a few comments, and then others, Arthur maybe, and others can also comment if they wish. So this is indeed a wonderful step forward and an achievement, without a doubt. However, of course, looking again to the sort of macro global governance deficits, this exists also in the field of international human rights. The international human rights architecture is very weak. Again, it's based on a voluntary model. So in terms of whether this will really protect people's rights to a clean environment, to a healthy environment around the world, of course, it's more aspirational and exhortative. However, it is part of this normative conceptual shift about our shared international values, which is incredibly important. So just FYI, in the Cambridge University Press book that Arthur Anagusto and I wrote, there's a whole chapter on how we might take the next steps to update our global international human rights architecture. And it's all interdependent, as you see, like governance of climate, ecological issues, and also the human dimension, as Wendy was saying, in terms of women's rights, our human rights. And again, but this is, as Jürgen mentioned, this is a top implementation issue for our climate and ecological goals, the empowerment of women and girls around the world. So why isn't everything this out from the mountaintops and making sure empowerment of women and girls is expedited at the national level and everywhere. So long answer, I guess, but yes, a wonderful step forward, but we have a lot more work to do.
Sure, please. And I think this is the last question, because we were told to wrap up before 5 p.m. and then just as an announcement, then we have 15 minutes break. 5:15, we will have the announcement and the launch of the eco pledges of the Scottish Baha'is.
Robert Richard from the Environment Trust. I would like to thank you all, particularly Anne and Mary, for your work and support. We're also just a side bench for action on we're just focusing on. And what I'd like to ask you is one of the key elements of the overall process is the ambition mechanism, trying to encourage countries to be more ambitious within their goals. Themes is seen roots of that process now, but with the desire to go further, we still feel that we're not in faster progression. So do you have any thoughts as to how you can improve upon that ambition mechanism in order to get more courageous?
Thank you. So the question is about the so-called ratchet mechanism, in which countries can raise their ambition in terms of emission cuts and other actions for climate change. and how that can be further improved and how we can increase ambition. With the other.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the key question. But I just wanted to make sure that we don't overlook the fact that we are yet to see one ingredient of the cycle, and that is the global stocktake. And that is basically first such global stocktake is to be concluded by 2023, and is starting. The preparations for that are starting, and that's a critically important part of that cycle. And I just had a conversation earlier today with one of the leaders of that, and one of the key points there is that global stocktake becomes empowering for solutions and empowering for acceleration, and something that gives courage, and is not, so it's not just a quantitative how much, but focuses on how it can be accelerated. And but the another ingredient that we have to be also cognizant of is the assumption that there is peer pressure, that there is political moment in this, and this is why these global gatherings are critically important. But it also comes down to not just political will, in my view, but the political mandate that leaders get from the suffering. And one country, for example, a fairly large one, Australia, has had its enormous suffering, actually, but it has not been translated into a political mandate to the extent possible. But if I could just, I wanted to just also, because we also need to be accentuate the positive. There was this notion of unity that in its different dimensions, and I wanted to submit to you that I do sense that we are coming to a change on this relationship to nature question. And one manifestation of that is the conversation about the strategic plan of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Kunming process that has not been concluded, and a very encouraging new report from UNEP on basically that we need to change our attitude to nature and our relationship to nature, and that being a very fundamental part, and that includes the food system. And as we know that the greatest pressure next to climate change on nature, our natural system, is our food system, which is entirely unsustainable. And so that is, I think, and let's not separate it too much from climate. Yes, and that has been done for too long. I think it makes sense in '92 in Rio to come up with 3 conventions, the third one being with the certification. But that separation has been brought far too long into separational thinking in terms of making progress, and so the synergies here are enormous. And I see some positive signs there, including what I just mentioned on this major initiative on deforestation and ecosystem restoration. Thank you.
Thank you, Helder. And also thanks to all of you for raising all those inspiring, enticing ideas. I hope we can really act on them. And maybe I could wrap up with a short meditation that I see here hanging on the wall in front of me for the past 2 hours. So it says, ye all the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one. Thank you very much.
See if I come back and keep eating.